concerning that objection against the doctrine which has been maintained, that it agrees with the Stoical doctrine of fate and the opinions of Mr. Hobbes. When Calvinists oppose the Arminian notion of the freedom of will and contingence of volition, and insist that there are no acts of the will, nor any other events whatsoever, but what are attended with some kind of necessity, well, their opposers exclaim against them, as agreeing with the ancient Stoics in their doctrine of fate, and with Mr. Hobbes in his opinion of necessity. It would not be worthwhile to take notice of so impertinent an objection had it not been urged by some of the chief Arminian writers. And there were many important truths maintained by the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, and especially the Stoics, that are never the worse for being held by them. The Stoic philosophers, by the general agreement of Christian divines, and even Arminian divines, were the greatest, wisest, and most virtuous of all the heathen philosophers, and in their doctrine and practice came the nearest to Christianity of any of their sects. How frequently are the sayings of these philosophers in many of the writings and sermons, even of Arminian divines, produced, not as arguments for the falseness of the doctrines which they delivered, but as a confirmation of some of the greatest truths of the Christian religion relating to the unity and perfections of the Godhead, a future state, the duty and happiness of mankind, etc., and how the light of nature and reason in the wisest and best of the heathen harmonized with and confirms the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it is very remarkable concerning Dr. Whitby that although he alleges the agreement of the Stoics with us, wherein he supposes they maintained the like doctrine as an argument against the truth of ours, yet this very Dr. Whitby alleges the agreement of the Stoics with the Arminian, wherein he supposes they taught the same doctrine with them, as an argument for the truth of their doctrine. And so that, when the Stoics agree with them, it is a confirmation of their doctrine, and a confutation of ours, as showing that our opinions are contrary to the natural sense and common reason of mankind. Now, nevertheless, when the Stoics agree with us, it argues no such thing in our favor, but, on the contrary, is a great argument against us, and shows our doctrine to be heathenish. It is observed by some Calvinistic writers that the Arminians symbolize with the Stoics in some of those doctrines wherein they are opposed by the Calvinists, particularly in their denying an original, innate, total corruption and utter depravity of heart, and in what the held of man's ability to make himself truly virtuous and conform to God, and in some other doctrines. It may be further observed that certainly it is no better objection against our doctrine that it agrees, in some respects, with the doctrine of the ancient Stoic philosophers than it is against theirs, wherein they differ from us, that it agrees, in some respects, with the opinion of the very worst of the heathen philosophers, the followers of Epicurus, the father of atheism and licentiousness, and with the doctrine of the Sadducees and Jesuits. I am not much concerned to know precisely what the ancient Stoic philosophers held concerning fate, in order to determine what is truth, as though it were a sure way to be in the right, to take good heed to differ from them. It seems that they differed among themselves, and probably the doctrine of fate, what we would call fatalism, as maintained by most of them, was in some respects erroneous. But whatever their doctrine was, if any of them held such a fate as is repugnant to any liberty, consisting in our doing as we please, I utterly deny such a fate. If they held any such fate as is not consistent with the common and universal notions that mankind have of liberty, activity, moral agency, virtue, and vice, I disclaim any such thing, and think I have demonstrated that the scheme I maintain is no such scheme. If the Stoics, by fate, meant anything of such a nature as can be supposed to stand in the way of advantage and benefit of in use of means and endeavors, or would make it less worthwhile for men to desire and seek after anything wherein their virtue and happiness consists, I hold no doctrine that is clogged with any such inconvenience, any more than any other scheme whatsoever, and by no means so much as the Arminian scheme of contingents as has been shown. If they held any such doctrine of universal fatality as is inconsistent with any kind of liberty, that is or can be any perfection, dignity, privilege, or benefit, or anything desirable in any respect for any intelligent creature, or indeed with any liberty that is possible or conceivable, I embrace no such doctrine. If they held any such doctrine of fate as is inconsistent with the world being in all things subject to the disposal of an intelligent, wise agent that presides, not as the soul of the world, but as the sovereign Lord of the universe, governing all things by proper will, choice, and design, in the exercise of the most perfect liberty conceivable, without subjection to any constraint, or being properly under the power or influence of anything before, above, or without himself, I wholly renounce any such doctrine. As to Mr. Hobbes maintaining the same doctrine concerning necessity, I confess, it happens that I never read Mr. Hobbes. Let his opinions, let his opinions be what it will. We need not reject all truth which is demonstrated by clear evidence, merely because it was once held by some bad man. This great truth, quote, that the Lord Jesus Christ is the Son of God, close quote, was not spoiled because it was once and again proclaimed with a loud voice by the devil. If truth is so defiled because it is spoken by the mouth or written by the pen of some ill-minded, mischievous man or mischievous man, that it must never be received, we shall never know. When we hold any of the most precious and evident truths by a sure tenure. And if Mr. Hobbes has made a bad use of this truth, that is to be lamented. But the truth is not to be thought worthy of rejection on that account. It is common for the corrupt hearts of evil men to abuse the best things to vile purposes. I might also take notice of its having been observed that the Arminians agree with Mr. Hobbes in many more things than the Calvinists, as in what he is said to hold concerning original sin, in denying the necessity of supernatural illumination, in denying infused grace, in denying the doctrine of justification by faith alone, and other things. Section 7. Concerning the necessity of the divine will. Some may, possibly, object against what has been supposed of the absurdity and inconsistency of a self-determining power in the will, and the impossibility of its being otherwise than that the will should be determined in every case by some motive, and by a motive which, as it stands in the view of the understanding, is of superior strength to any appearing on the other side. That if these things are true, it will follow that not only the will of created minds, but the will of God himself is necessary in all its determinations, concerning which the author of the essay on the freedom of the will in God and in the creature, that's page 85 and 86, says, quote, "What strange doctrine is this, contrary to all our ideas of the dominion of God? Does it not destroy the glory of his liberty of choice, and take away from the Creator and Governor and Benefactor of the world, that most free and sovereign agent, all the glory of this sort of freedom? Does it not seem to make him a kind of mechanical medium of fate, and introduce Mr. Hobbes' doctrine of fatality and necessity into all things that God hath to do with? Does it not seem to represent the blessed God as being of vast understanding, as well as power and efficiency, but still to leave him without a will to choose among all the objects within his view? In short, it seems to make the blessed God a sort of almighty minister of fate, under its universal and supreme influence, as it was the professed sentiment of some of the ancients, that fate was above the gods." Well, this is declaiming rather than arguing, and an application to men's imaginations and prejudices rather than to mere reason. I would now calmly endeavor to consider whether there be any reason in this frightful representation. But before I enter upon a particular consideration of the matter, I would observe that it is reasonable to suppose it should be much more difficult to express or conceive things according to exact metaphysical truth relating to the nature and manner of the existence of things in the divine understanding and will, and the operation of these faculties, if I may so call them, of the divine mind, than in the human mind, which is infinitely more within our view, more proportionate to the measure of our comprehension, and more commensurate to the use and import of human speech. Language is indeed very deficient in regard of terms to express precise truth concerning our own minds and their faculties and operations. Words were first formed to express external things, and those that are applied to express things internal and spiritual are almost all borrowed and used in a sort of figurative sense, whence they are, most of them, attended with a great deal of ambiguity and unfixedness in their signification, occasioning innumerable doubts, difficulties, and confusions in inquiries and controversies about things of this nature. But language is much less adapted to express things existing in the mind of the incomprehensible deity, precisely as they are. we find a great deal of difficulty in conceiving exactly of the nature of our own souls. And notwithstanding all the progress which has been made in past ages and the present in this kind of knowledge, whereby our metaphysics, as it relates to these things, is brought to greater perfection than once it was, yet here is still work enough left for future inquiries and researches, and room for progress still to be made for many ages and generations. But we had need to be infinitely able metaphysicians to conceive with clearness, according to strict, proper, and perfect truth, concerning the nature of the divine essence, and the modes of action and operation in the powers of the divine mind. And it may be noted particularly that though we are obliged to conceive of some things in God as consequent and dependent on others, and of some things pertaining to the divine nature and will as the foundation of others, and so before others in the order of nature, as we must conceive of the knowledge and holiness of God as prior in the order of nature to his happiness, the perfection of his understanding as the foundation of his wise purposes and decrees, the holiness of his nature as the cause and reason of his holy determinations. And yet, when we speak of cause and effect, antecedent and consequent, fundamental and dependent, determining and determined, in the first being, who is self-existent, independent, of perfect and absolute simplicity and immutability, and the first cause of all things, doubtless there must be less propriety in such representations than when we speak of derived dependent beings, who are compounded and liable to perpetual mutation and succession. Excuse me. Having premised this, I proceed to observe concerning the forementioned author's exclamation about the necessary determination of God's will in all things by what he sees to be fittest and best. That all the seeming force of such objections and exclamations must arise from an imagination that there is some sort of privilege or dignity in being without such a moral necessity as will make it impossible to do any other than always choose what is wisest and best, as though there were some disadvantage or meanness and subjection in such a necessity, a thing by which the will was confined or kept under and held in servitude by something which, as it were, maintained a strong and invincible power and dominion over it by bonds that held him fast, and from which he could by no means deliver himself. Whereas this must be all mere imagination and delusion. It is no disadvantage or dishonor to a being necessarily to act in the most excellent and happy manner from the necessary perfection of his own nature. And this argues no imperfection, inferiority, or dependence, nor any lack of dignity, privilege, or ascendancy. It is not inconsistent with the absolute and most perfect sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God is his ability and authority to do whatever pleases him, whereby, quote, he doth according to his will in the armies of heaven and amongst the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand, or say unto him, What doest thou? The following things belong to the sovereignty of God. Number 1, supreme, universal, and infinite power, whereby he is able to do what he pleases, without control, without any confinement of that power, without any subjection in the least measure to any other power, and so without any hindrance or restraint, that it should be either impossible or at all difficult for him to accomplish his will, and without any dependence of his power on any other power from whence it should be derived, or of which it should stand in any need. So far from this, that all other power is derived from him, and that is absolutely dependent on him. Number 2, that he has supreme authority, absolute and most perfect right to do what he wills without subjection to any superior authority or any derivation of authority from any other, or limitation by any distinct independent authority, either superior, equal, or inferior. He, being the head of all dominion and fountain of all authority, and also without restraint by any obligation, implying either subjection, derivation, or dependence, or proper limitation. Number 3, that his will is supreme, underived, and independent on anything without himself, being in everything determined by his own counsel, having no other rule but his own wisdom, his will not being subject to or restrained by the will of any other, and other wills being perfectly subject to his. Number 4, that his wisdom, which determines his will, is supreme, perfect, underived, self-sufficient, and independent, so that it may be said, as in Isaiah 40, verse 14, quote, With whom took he counsel? And who instructed him and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding, close quote. There is no other divine sovereignty but this, and this is properly absolute sovereignty. No other is desirable, nor would any other be honorable or happy. And indeed, there is no other conceivable or possible. It is the glory and greatness of the divine sovereign that his will is determined by his own infinite, all-sufficient wisdom in everything, and is in nothing at all directed either by inferior wisdom or by no wisdom, whereby it would become senseless and arbitrariness, determining and acting without reason, design, or end. Now, if you believe that today, I'm going to just make a comment. If you believe these things today, you immediately get labeled a hyper-Calvinist. And you know it's true. Back to the reading. If God's will is steadily and surely determined in everything by supreme wisdom, then it is in everything necessarily determined to that which is most wise. And certainly it would be a disadvantage and indignity to be otherwise. For if the divine will was not necessarily determined to what in every case is wisest and best, it must be subject to some degree of undesigning contingents, and so in the same degree liable to evil. To suppose the divine will liable to be carried hither and thither at random by the uncertain wind of blind contingents, which is guided by no wisdom, no motive, no intelligent dictate whatsoever, if any such thing were possible, would certainly argue a great degree of imperfection and meanness, infinitely unworthy of the deity. If it be a disadvantage for the divine will to be attended with this moral necessity, then the more free from it, and the more left at random, the greater dignity and advantage. And consequently, to be perfectly free from the direction of understanding, and universally and entirely left to senseless, unmeaning continence, to act absolutely at random, would be the supreme glory. And it no more argues any dependence of God's will that his supremely wise volition is necessary, than it argues that a dependence of his being, that is, existence, is necessary. If it be something too low for the supreme being to have his will determined by moral necessity, so as necessarily in every case to will in the highest degree, holily and happily, then why is it not also something too low for him to have his existence, and the infinite perfection of his nature, and his infinite happiness determined by necessity? It is no more to God's dishonor to be necessarily wise than to be necessarily holy. And if neither of them is the beauty of this necessity, that it is strong as faith itself, with all the advantage of reason and goodness, it is strange to see men contend that the deity is not free, because he is necessarily rational, immutably good to his dishonor. Then it is not to his dishonor necessarily to act holily and wisely. And if it be not dishonorable to be necessarily holy and wise in the highest possible degree, no more is it mean and dishonorable necessarily to act holily and wisely in the highest possible degree, or, which is the same thing, to do that, in every case, which, above all other things, is wisest and best. Well, the reason why it is not dishonorable to be necessarily most holy is because holiness in itself is an excellent and honorable thing. For the same reason, it is no dishonor to be necessarily most wise, and in every case to act most wisely, or do the thing which is the wisest of all. For wisdom is also in itself excellent and honorable. The aforementioned author of the essay on the freedom of will, etc., as has been observed, represents that doctrine of the divine will being in everything necessarily determined by superior fitness, as making the blessed God a kind of almighty minister and mechanical medium of fate. Well, he insists in pages 93 and 94 that this moral necessity and impossibility is, in effect, the same thing with physical and natural necessity, and impossibility, and says in pages 54 and 55, quote, "The scheme which determines the will, always and certainly by the understanding, and the understanding by the appearance of things, seems to take away the true nature of vice and virtue. For the sublimest of virtues and the vilest of vices seem rather to be matters of fate and necessity, flowing naturally and necessarily from the existence, the circumstances, and present situation of persons and things. For this existence and situation necessarily makes such an appearance to the mind, and from this appearance flows a necessary perception and judgment concerning these things. This judgment necessarily determines the will, and thus, by this chain of necessary causes, virtue and vice would lose their nature and become natural ideas and necessary things, instead of moral and free actions." Close quote. And yet, this same author allows, in pages 30 and 31, that a perfectly wise being will constantly and certainly choose what is most fit, and says, in pages 102 and 103, quote, "I grant, and always have granted, that wheresoever there is such antecedent, superior fitness of things, God acts according to it, so as never to contradict it, and particularly in all his judicial proceedings as a governor and distributor of rewards and punishments." Close quote. Yea, he says expressly in page 42, quote, "that it is not possible for God to act otherwise than according to this fitness and goodness in things." Close quote. So that, according to this author, putting these several passages of his essay together, there is no virtue, nor anything of a moral nature in the most sublime and glorious acts and exercises of God's holiness, justice, and faithfulness. And he never does anything which is in itself supremely worthy, and above all other things, fit and excellent, but only as a kind of mechanical medium of fate, and in what he does as the judge and moral governor of the world. He exercises no moral excellency, exercising no freedom in these things, because he acts by moral necessity, which is, in effect, the same with physical or natural necessity, and therefore he only acts by an hobbitistical fatality. Close quote. As a being indeed of vast understanding. Actually, this is the quote here. Sorry about the direction there. This text is kind of strange, the way it's printed out here. Quote, "As a being indeed of vast understanding, as well as power and efficiency, as he said before, but without a will to choose, being a kind of almighty minister of fate, acting under its supreme influence. For he allows that in all these things, God's will is determined consistently and certainly by a superior fitness, and that it is not possible for him to act otherwise. And if these things are so," by the way, you can close the quote on that, "and if these things are so, what glory or praise belongs to God for doing holily and justly, or taking the most fit, holy, wise, and excellent course in any one instance? Whereas, according to the Scriptures, and also the common sense of mankind, it does not, in the least, derogate from the honor of any being, that through the moral perfection of his nature, he necessarily acts with supreme wisdom and holiness, but on the contrary, his praise is the greater, and herein consists the height of his glory. The same author, on page 56, supposes that herein appears the excellent, quote, character of a wise and good man, that though he can choose contrary to the fitness of things, yet he does not, but suffers himself, that allows himself, to be directed by fitness, close quote, and that in this conduct, quote, he imitates the blessed God, close quote. And yet, he supposes it contrariwise with the blessed God, and not that he suffers himself, or not that he suffers himself to be directed by fitness when he, quote, can choose contrary to the fitness of things, close quote, but that, quote, he cannot choose contrary to the fitness of things, close quote, as he says in page 42. Here's another quote from this author, that it is not possible for God to act otherwise than according to this fitness, where there is any fitness or goodness in things, close quote. Yea, he supposes, in page 31, that if a man, quote, were perfectly wise and good, he could not do otherwise than be constantly and certainly determined by the fitness of things, close quote. One more thing I would observe before I conclude this section, and that is, that if it derogate nothing from the glory of God to be necessarily determined by superior fitness in some things, then neither does it to be thus determined in all things, from anything in the nature of such necessity, as at all detracting from God's freedom, independence, absolute supremacy, or any dignity or glory of his nature, state, or manner of acting, or as implying any infirmity, restraint, or subjection. And if the thing be such as well consists with God's glory, and has nothing tending at all to detract from it, then we need not be afraid of ascribing it to God in too many things, lest thereby we should detract from God's glory too much.